The secret emotional life behind America's most charismatic president. The photograph exists in black and white, fading at the edges like a memory that refuses to fully crystallize. A young man, barely 30, stands on a stage in Massachusetts, sweat glistening on his forehead despite the October chill. His jaw is clenched, his hand trembles just slightly as he grips the wooden podium. In that frozen moment, captured by a photographer whose name history forgot, you can see it written across his face. Fear. Pure, crystalline fear. This is not the John F. Kennedy America would come to know. This is not the man who would stand at the precipice of nuclear annihilation and stare it down with an almost supernatural calm. This is not the charismatic president whose voice would echo across generations, whose image would be projected onto the ceiling of the nation's collective consciousness forever. This is a young man terrified that he is not enough, that he will never be enough, that the weight of expectation pressing down on his shoulders will crush him before he ever reaches the summit he's been told his entire life he must climb. And yet, in that terrified moment, something remarkable was happening inside him. A transformation, a metamorphosis from boy to statesman, from shadow to light, from the overlooked middle child to the man who would change the course of history. This is his story. Not the story you've read in textbooks, not the sanitized version told in classrooms and documentaries. This is the real story, the one about the wounded man beneath the legend and how that wounding became the very thing that made him extraordinary. To understand John Fitzgerald Kennedy, you first have to understand what it meant to be a Kennedy in 1917, the year he was born in the Irish neighborhoods of Boston. You have to understand that names in families like this are not merely identifiers. They are blueprints. They are destinies whispered in the dark by ambitious fathers who see their sons not as individuals to be nurtured, but as extensions of their own incomplete dreams. Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. was a man constructed entirely from hunger. He was born into poverty, the kind that leaves permanent marks on a person's psychology, and he had clawed his way to extraordinary wealth through means both brilliant and ruthless. He had been a banker, a bootlegger, a movie producer, an ambassador. He had accumulated wealth and power with the singular focus of a man on a mission. But something gnawed at him constantly, something no amount of money could purchase: respectability in the eyes of old money America. The WASP establishment would never fully accept him, no matter how many zeros appeared in his bank account. And so he did what ambitious men of limited options do. He invested his dreams in his sons. Joseph Jr., the eldest, was groomed from birth to be president. He was golden, athletic, brilliant, everything a Kennedy heir was supposed to be. And then there was Jack. Jack was sick. This simple fact, rarely spoken aloud in the Kennedy household, but understood by everyone who lived there, became the organizing principle of his childhood. Constant fevers, mysterious illnesses that would sideline him for weeks, sometimes months. Doctors cycling through their diagnoses like shopkeepers cycling through merchandise. Scarlet fever, whooping cough, influenza, colitis. Each illness came with the implicit message: you are fragile, you are unreliable, you are the weak one. In photographs from his childhood, there's a sadness to his eyes that seems disproportionate to his age. While Joseph Jr. dominated the lawn in front of the family's compounds, while his sisters laughed and played without consequence, Jack was often inside, watching from windows, or lying in bed listening to the muffled sounds of normalcy happening without him. His father barely looked at him, not out of cruelty exactly. Joe Kennedy was too pragmatic for simple cruelty, rather out of a kind of mathematical assessment. Jack was redundant, Jack was backup, Jack was the spare. But children absorbed these calculations in ways that damaged them profoundly. Jack learned early that love was something you had to earn, that you had to prove yourself worthy of basic familial regard. He learned that being sick was a personal failure. He learned that being less than your brother wasn't just a fact of nature, it was a kind of betrayal. And so he began to hide, not just his illnesses, which he learned to bear without complaint, but his entire inner world. He became a performer, always, in the presence of his father. He learned to crack jokes at precisely the moment vulnerability might show through. He learned to deflect with charm what he couldn't express with words. His mother, Rose Kennedy, was a woman of ice and discipline, Pious, rigid, devoted to a vision of family that looked correct from the outside but felt hollow in the spaces where warmth should have been. She taught her children to move through the world like pieces on a chessboard, always calculating their next move, always aware that they were being watched, always aware that failure reflected not just on them, but on the entire family enterprise. By the time young Jack was 10 years old, something had crystallized inside him, a dual consciousness. There was the public Jack, charming, witty, apparently effortless, and there was the private Jack, the one who listened more than he spoke, the one who observed people with an almost scientific precision, the one who harbored a deep well of rage at being deemed the expendable one. This duality would never leave him. It would follow him into adolescence, into adulthood, into the highest office in the land, and it would both destroy him and define him. When Joseph Jr. went to Harvard, it was treated like a coronation. The golden child was ascending to the throne that his father had metaphorically constructed for him. There were photographs in the newspapers. There were dinners at the best restaurants. There was an absolute certainty that this boy, this perfect specimen of Kennedy ambition, would be president. When Jack went to Harvard 3 years later, the expectation was different. Not larger, smaller. Survive, the implicit message seemed to be, get educated, don't embarrass the family, be adequate. And Jack, with the sensitivity of a wounded animal who has learned to read the subtle shifts in his master's attention, felt this difference acutely. His first years at Harvard were, by his own later admission, a kind of fog. He was sick frequently, the mysterious illnesses returning with regularity, and he was profoundly lonely in a way that had nothing to do with being on a campus full of people. He would sit in his dormitory room and write letters home. Formal, careful letters to his parents, letters that revealed nothing of what he actually felt. Behind closed doors, he struggled with depression, though that word was not yet in common use, and certainly not a word that Kennedy spoke aloud. He felt himself to be fundamentally inadequate. He watched his brother, golden, confident, clearly destined for greatness, and felt the weight of his own ordinariness like a stone in his chest. And yet, something else was happening too. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Jack began to develop his own way of moving through the world. He joined the social clubs, yes, because that's what Kennedys did. But he began to actually listen to people. He began to read voraciously, history, biography, politics, philosophy, absorbing knowledge like a sponge. While other young men were performing their socializing, Jack was observing, learning, building an internal architecture of understanding. He began to develop a philosophy early on, a skepticism toward the easy answers, toward inherited wisdom. In his journals, in letters to close friends, you can see the seeds of the man he would become, someone who distrusted ideology, who was drawn to complexity, who understood that human beings were rarely as simple as their public presentations suggested. But none of this mattered to his father. Joseph Sr. had already decided what Jack's life would be. His son would go into government, perhaps, in a secondary capacity. He would have a respectable career, make a respectable marriage, produce respectable grandchildren. He would be adequate. He would not be president. This calculus haunted Jack. He could feel it in every interaction with his father, a kind of paternal dismissal that was never quite stated directly, but was understood with complete clarity. He was the spare tire. He was the backup plan. He was the Kennedy who would carry on the name, but never define the dynasty. What Joseph Sr. could not have predicted, what no one could have predicted, was that this wounding, this systematic underestimation, this fundamental dismissal, would become the crucible in which a far more interesting leader would be forged. The world changed on December 7th, 1941, when Japanese planes descended from the sky over Pearl Harbor and killed over 1,000 American sailors. The attack was meant to cripple American military power. Instead, it ignited something in the American consciousness, a sense of unity, of purpose, of necessity. For young men of fighting age, for ambitious young men, for young men with something to prove. The war was a summons. It was an opportunity. It was a test. Jack Kennedy, now in his mid-20s, was still struggling with health issues. His back was troubling him, a chronic condition that would plague him for the rest of his life. His digestive system remained unpredictable. By any reasonable medical standard, He was not well suited to military service, but Joseph Jr. had already enlisted in the Navy. Joseph Jr. naturally was training to be a fighter pilot. Joseph Jr. was already performing acts of heroism in the skies over Europe, and Jack could not bear to remain behind. Later, in the carefully constructed mythology of the Kennedy family, what happened next would be presented as a straightforward tale of heroism. PT-109, a patrol torpedo boat, sank in the South Pacific. Jack Kennedy, commanding the vessel, survived. 2 men under his command did not. He swam, injured, pulling a wounded crew member with him to an island. He was rescued. He was decorated. But the truth, as with most truths about human beings, was more complicated and infinitely more interesting. Jack did not seek command of PT-109. He was assigned to it, a relatively prestigious assignment for a junior officer, but nothing extraordinary. He was, by all accounts, a decent but not exceptional commanding officer. His crew respected him, but they did not revere him. He was competent. He was present. He was adequate. And then, in darkness, the Japanese destroyer Amagiri collided with PT-109, and in a few seconds, everything changed. The official reports, the ones that would be filed and recorded and eventually immortalized in history, presented a straightforward narrative of heroism. But the letters Jack wrote in the weeks and months after the incident tell a more complex story. He was traumatized. He experienced profound guilt about the men he lost. He questioned whether he had made mistakes, whether there was something he could have done differently. He did swim to the island. He did display physical courage, but he also experienced something else, the overwhelming weight of responsibility for other human lives. He had sent men into combat. Those men had died. No amount of official citation could erase that reality. What's remarkable is what Jack Kennedy did with that experience. He did not compartmentalize it. He did not bury it beneath the narrative of heroism that his father was already constructing. Instead, he felt it. He sat with it. He wrote about it in personal correspondence, where his guard was down and his true self could emerge. "I think I can appreciate better than many people the desire to get into combat," he wrote to a friend. But he also wrote, with haunting prescience, "In all my years of life, I have never been through anything like it." This was not the performance. This was the reality. When he returned home, decorated and physically recovered, though his back injuries had worsened from the ordeal, he was presented to American society as a war hero. It was precisely the kind of credential that could launch a political career, and Joseph Sr. had already begun calculating whether his second son might, in fact, have some political utility after all. But something fundamental had shifted inside Jack Kennedy. He had tasted mortality. He had experienced responsibility in its rawest form. He had felt the weight of decisions that resulted in death, and he could not unknow any of it. He was no longer a boy trying to prove himself to an indifferent father. He was a man who understood, in a way that most people never would, that life was fragile and that leadership meant carrying the consequences of your choices for the rest of your existence. This understanding would define him from that moment forward. Everything changed when Joseph Jr. died. On August 12, 1944, Jack's older brother was piloting a bomber in an operation over Europe when something went catastrophically wrong. The plane exploded. There were no survivors. The golden child, the one who had been groomed from birth to be president, was simply gone, vaporized into the history he was meant to make. For Joseph Sr., it was the moment his world collapsed. He had invested everything, his ambitions, his fantasies, his entire conception of the future, into Joseph Jr. His second son, the spare, had survived the war when the heir had not. The mathematics of ambition suddenly shifted in ways Joe could not compute. For Jack, the death of his brother was a complex emotional experience that would have taken years, perhaps a lifetime, to fully process. There was grief, certainly, but there was also something darker, the sudden, catastrophic understanding that he would now have to step into a role he had never wanted, carry a burden he had never asked to bear, pursue a destiny that had belonged to someone else. In the weeks after Joseph Jr.'s death, Jack fell into a depression so profound that his friends were genuinely concerned for his mental health. He became reclusive. He made cryptic comments about the meaninglessness of existence. He seemed, to those who knew him best, to have lost his moorings. But what was happening beneath the surface was a profound recalibration. Jack Kennedy, who had spent his entire life believing himself to be the expendable one, now understood that he was, in fact, the only one. The burden of family expectation, which had previously been fractured among siblings, now concentrated entirely upon him. This realization arrived not as a comfort, but as a crushing weight. His father, grieving and desperate to find some meaning in his loss, looked at his surviving son with new eyes. If Joseph Jr. could not be president, then perhaps Jack could. It was not a transformation born of love or recognition of Jack's individual worth. It was the mathematics of ambition recalculating itself in the face of death. It was the substitution of one asset for another. But Jack, perhaps for the first time in his life, did not fight this pressure. Instead, he absorbed it. He took the mantle that his father was placing on his shoulders, not out of a sudden desire for power, but out of a sense of obligation. His brother was dead. The family dynasty would not die with him. There was a role that needed to be filled, and by default of biology, it was his to fill. What began as an obligation would, over time, become a calling. But in that immediate aftermath of grief, it was simply another weight to carry. Political careers do not spring forth fully formed. They are constructed brick by brick through a combination of opportunity, ambition, timing, and often inherited advantage. Jack Kennedy's entry into politics was no exception. In 1946, running for a congressional seat in Massachusetts, he was not yet the figure he would become. He was still awkward in crowds, uncomfortable with the small talk of retail politics. His war record was impressive on paper, but he himself seemed oddly disconnected from it, as though he couldn't quite believe his own mythology. He won anyway. The Kennedy name, the money behind it, the machinery that his father had constructed, these were enough to carry him across the finish line. In Congress, he was undistinguished. Not lazy, not incompetent, but not remarkable. He showed up, he voted, he delivered constituent services. He was, by all accounts, a competent representative, but he gave no indication that he was destined for anything greater. What observers at the time could not have known was that Jack Kennedy was using these years for something other than climbing the political ladder. He was reading, he was thinking. He was developing a philosophy of governance that was not inherited from his father or from the Republican establishment that dominated the early post-war years. He was becoming an intellectual. This might seem like a small thing, but it was revolutionary in the context of American politics. His father was a businessman, an operator, someone who moved through the world accumulating power. But Jack was different. He was drawn to ideas. He read history as though it contained lessons. He thought about the nature of political power and responsibility in ways that seemed almost philosophical. In private conversations, in letters to friends, you can see the evolution of his thinking. He was beginning to formulate a vision of America's role in the world that was neither isolationist nor imperialistic. He was thinking about the relationship between government and individual liberty in ways that suggested deeper intellectual engagement with the material. When he moved to the Senate in 1952, it was with a growing sense that he had something to say, something to contribute. But the Senate in 1952 was not a place where young men with ideas were celebrated. It was a club of powerful men who had earned their positions through decades of service and political maneuvering. Jack Kennedy, the young senator from Massachusetts with the war record and the famous father and the $1 million smile, was not taken particularly seriously. And so he did something that would become characteristic of his approach to challenges. He refused to be constrained by other people's expectations. He began writing a book, a serious historical and political analysis of Senate courage in American history. It would later become Profiles in Courage, and it would win the Pulitzer Prize. The book was significant not because it was a masterpiece of political philosophy, it wasn't, but because it revealed something important about Jack Kennedy. He was genuinely engaged with ideas. He was thinking about what it meant to be a leader, what it meant to take courageous stands, what history could teach about the present moment. He was becoming something that few people in American politics had been or would be, an intellectual warrior, not someone who used ideas as camouflage for ambition, but someone who genuinely believed that serious thinking had a role to play in governance. This intellectual engagement, combined with his physical charisma and his political positioning, was beginning to create something unprecedented in American politics. A figure who could appeal to both the educated elites and the general public, who could discuss ideas without seeming pedantic, who could move through the world with an ease that suggested both confidence and genuine curiosity. But he was still uncertain, still wounded, still in many ways the boy who had been told he was not enough, performing his way through life, hoping that if he performed well enough, perhaps people would not see the fragility beneath the facade. In 1956, at the Democratic National Convention, something shifted. Adlai Stevenson, the Democratic nominee, threw the vice presidential slot open to the convention to decide. It was chaos, it was unprecedented, and it was an opportunity. Jack Kennedy, in his mind playing for an advantage on a future ticket, began campaigning for the spot. He gave speech after speech, walking the corridors of the convention, shaking hands, making his case. He was energized, he was alive. He was no longer performing an expected role, he was creating one. Estes Kefauver, a more established politician, ultimately won the nod. Jack Kennedy lost. But something remarkable happened in that loss. The political world, watching this young senator campaign with such energy and conviction, began to see him differently. He was not just a handsome war hero coasting on his father's name. He was a genuine political operator. He was someone to watch. More importantly, Jack Kennedy began to see himself differently. In the aftermath of that convention, in the failure and the disappointment, something crystallized. He understood, perhaps for the first time in a way that was not theoretical, what it meant to actually want something, to actually fight for something beyond the expectations placed on him. He had always been talented, he had always had advantages, but he had never truly tested himself against real opposition. He had never known what it meant to want something so badly that the thought of not having it was painful. This loss, paradoxically, awakened something in him that had been dormant. "I'm going to be president," he told people after the convention. Not "I might run for president someday," not "perhaps I could be president." The certainty was absolute, and what's fascinating is that people who heard him say this did not dismiss it out of hand. Something in his voice, in his bearing, in the absolute certainty of his pronouncement made it seem not arrogant but simply factual, as though he was describing something that had already been determined by history. What would you have done? Is the question that echoes through the empty corridors of history at this moment. Would you have had the courage to transform failure into fuel? Would you have had the conviction to speak your destiny into being, even when the world seemed determined to provide you with a different role? But we're not finished. This was only the beginning of his true transformation. What followed was a remarkable campaign of political positioning that has rarely been equaled in American history. Jack Kennedy, understanding that he needed something more than just political savvy, he needed a narrative, a reason for America to believe in him, set about constructing that narrative with ruthless precision. He positioned himself as the voice of a new generation. Not the old guard that had run the Democratic Party, not the tired machines of the previous era, but something fresh, something vital, something that seemed to represent the future rather than merely manage the past. He worked his relationships, he built alliances, he mended fences with party operatives who had previously dismissed him. He was everywhere, always, building the infrastructure of a presidential campaign while maintaining the plausible deniability that he wasn't actually running yet. And critically, he evolved. The shy, somewhat awkward young senator began to transform into something far more polished. He worked with speechwriters, with image consultants, with advisors who understood that politics in the television age was as much about perception as about policy. But here's what's important. Jack Kennedy did not become cynical in this process. He did not transform himself into a hollow performance of ambition. Instead, he seemed to genuinely grow into the role that was being created. The intellectual development continued, the reading continued, the serious engagement with ideas continued. He gave speeches about America's role in a changing world that showed genuine geopolitical sophistication. He spoke about civil rights in ways that were politically risky, but intellectually consistent. He positioned himself as someone who understood that the world was more complex than simple slogans could capture, and that America needed a leader who could navigate that complexity. By 1960, when he declared his candidacy for the presidency, Jack Kennedy was not just the son of an ambitious businessman with political connections. He was not just a handsome war hero trading on his heroic narrative. He was something far more complex and far more compelling. A genuine political figure who had thought deeply about the nature of power and responsibility. He was also still deeply wounded, still carrying the internal scars of a childhood spent in the shadow of an indifferent father, and an always adequate but never extraordinary sense of his own worth. Still struggling with chronic pain from his back injuries, still battling the illnesses that had plagued him since childhood. But these wounds, paradoxically, had become sources of strength. They had given him empathy. They had given him an understanding of human fragility that allowed him to connect with people in ways that purely privileged or purely confident politicians could never do. They had given him the ability to look at someone and see not just their surface, but the struggles beneath it. The 1960 presidential campaign was, by any measure, remarkable. Jack Kennedy against Richard Nixon, youth against experience, Eastern establishment versus Western pragmatism, the charismatic New Englander against the hardened Cold War warrior. And Jack Kennedy, the boy who had been told his entire life that he was not enough, that he was the spare, that his brother would be the one to change the world, found himself in the position to do exactly that. The debates with Nixon became the pivot point. On television, in a medium that had not before been the arbiter of presidential contests, Jack Kennedy's charisma, his ease, his ability to convey both intelligence and approachability, contrasted sharply with Nixon's discomfort and his visible anxiety. In the first debate, watched by millions of Americans, Jack Kennedy became president. Not officially, that would come later. But in the minds of the American people, something shifted. This was not a boy trying to prove himself to an indifferent world. This was a man who had evolved beyond his limitations, who had transformed his wounds into wisdom, who had constructed a vision of American leadership that seemed to point toward something greater than what had come before. He won the election by the narrowest of margins. The results were so close that there would be questions about fraud for decades afterward. But when Kennedy was sworn in, something became undeniably clear. America had elected a new kind of leader, young, intellectual, charismatic, complex. On January 20th, 1961, standing on the steps of the Capitol, his hand raised to take the oath of office, Jack Kennedy was no longer the boy in the shadow. He was no longer the spare. He was no longer the one deemed inadequate by a father's calculation or limited by a lifetime of illness and underestimation. He was the President of the United States. And in that moment, watching this young man who had transformed himself through sheer force of will and psychological evolution take the highest office in the land, one could not help but think, what an extraordinary journey this has been. From the sickly child in the shadow of his brother to the wounded war hero, to the political operator who understood that the greatest campaigns are those we run against ourselves. But here is where the story becomes tragic, where the narrative gains a dimension that none of those who watched Kennedy's rise could have anticipated. Because embedded in the very triumph of Jack Kennedy's ascent, in the moment where he overcame every obstacle, defeated every rival, transcended every limitation, was the seed of a darkness that history would later unfold. He had spent his entire life being told that he needed to be extraordinary. That adequacy was not enough. That he had to prove himself worthy of the Kennedy name, worthy of America's investment in him, worthy of the destiny his father had so carefully constructed. And in achieving the presidency, in reaching the summit that had seemed so distant when he was that sick, lonely boy in Massachusetts, he had proven something that he would spend the rest of his presidency trying to prove over and over again. That he was enough, that he was capable, that his life meant something. But the poison of that endless striving for validation was that it never quite ended. He was always, in some fundamental way, still trying to prove something, still competing, still seeking, still unable to simply be without constantly performing, constantly achieving, constantly reaching for something beyond the reach of normal human experience. The presidency did not cure Jack Kennedy of his fundamental wounds. It only transformed the stage upon which those wounds would be played out. There would be the Bay of Pigs, a catastrophic military misadventure that shattered any illusions about his infallibility. There would be the Cuban Missile Crisis, 13 days where he stared nuclear annihilation in the face and somehow navigated humanity through the most dangerous moment in recorded history. There would be the Civil Rights Movement, where his evolution as a moral figure was tested in real time. And there would be Dallas, November 22nd, 1963. The moment that would transform him from a living, breathing, complex human being into a frozen image, forever young, forever valiant, forever encased in the amber of historical memory. But that is another story. That is the story of how a man's life becomes a myth, and how myths are often more powerful, more instructive, more transformative than the messy reality that precedes them. What we have traced in Jack Kennedy's rise is something far more interesting than a simple biography or a recitation of historical facts. We have traced the journey of a wounded person who refused to accept the limitations others placed on him, who transformed his pain into purpose, who looked at the role history seemed to have assigned him and said, "No, I will define myself." He did not overcome his wounds by ignoring them. He overcame them by acknowledging them, by feeling them, by allowing them to inform his understanding of what it meant to lead. And yet, and this is crucial, his achievements did not erase those wounds. They existed side by side, the confident president and the insecure boy, the eloquent speaker who had once stuttered with anxiety, the decisive leader who still sometimes felt like the spare, the backup plan, the one deemed inadequate by forces beyond his control. This is what makes Jack Kennedy's story so deeply human and so deeply instructive. He did not become a great leader by transcending his limitations. He became a great leader by integrating his limitations, by understanding that the very things that had damaged him were also the things that gave him the capacity to lead with wisdom and empathy. The question that echoes through his rise, the question that remains unanswered even now, decades after his death, is this: what would you have done when life told you that you were not enough, that you would always be second, that your dreams were bigger than your capacity, that your body betrayed you, that your own father seemed to view you as disposable? What would you have done? Would you have accepted the limitations and lived a smaller life? Would you have transformed the pain into fuel, as Kennedy did? Would you have found a way to prove, not to the world, but to yourself, that you were worthy of something greater? Or would you have broken beneath the weight, as so many do, as so many will? Jack Kennedy did not break. He bent. He evolved. He transformed himself through an act of psychological will that should inspire anyone who has ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or deemed inadequate by the world. That is his legacy, not the presidency, though that matters, not the glamour and the charisma, though those are real, but the fundamental, inspiring truth that a person can choose to become more than the role history initially assigns them. That wounds can become wisdom, that the very thing that damages us can, if we are brave enough and conscious enough, become the source of our greatest strength. This is the story of Jack Kennedy's rise. This is the story of how a boy became a man, how a man became a leader, and how a leader became a symbol that transformation is possible, that destiny is not fixed, and that the underestimated among us sometimes contain the greatest capacity for greatness.